piece from Mary Douglas, who happens to be one of my all-time favorite social scientists. She was probably the great anthropologist of the second half of the 20th century. She was British. She wrote a number of really incredible books, and really was the modern-day interpreter of Durkheim. Durkheim was always kind of in the back of her head as she was looking at society. The article I had you write about, or I had you read, was her discussing this idea of symbolic pollution. And symbolic pollution is one way, just like I mentioned some ways that Zerubbabel noted of thinking about cultural classification. Symbolic pollution is another way. Now, anthropologists for a long time talked about actual pollution. In other words, taboos in social groupings, where the social groupings would see somebody kind of biologically polluted by for example, behavior or something they've done. And what Mary Douglas helps us to understand is really that belief in kind of pollution. That's a fundamental taboo system or classification at work. And she says what we're really talking about here is symbolic pollution, that a lot of cultural classification is determining that someone, some space, some time, something is symbolically polluted. In other words, it's unclean or it's dirty. And what she wants to talk about in this article is that beliefs about cultural classification beliefs about dirtiness are primarily not about biological claims that something has bacteria on it, but instead are claims about how to order something or how to place things, how to make divisions, hence classification process. What's really intriguing about Douglas is that she makes some claims about what types of social situations we should find symbolic beliefs working in, or should we find that symbolic pollution beliefs are actually found. For example, she says that morally ill-defined situations in a society are places where symbolic pollution beliefs are often found. Let me give an example. In this country, especially in earlier decades, relationships, in this case we'll take between men and women, that were not legalized were ones in which the permanency of the relationship was unclear, and the legality of any children or property as part of the relationship were unclear. So in these situations, you would often hear terms such as a woman was a tramp, or a child was illegitimate, or a bastard. And these terms, actually, tramp, bastard, are terms connected to the animal world, are terms that evoke pollution or dirtiness. And for Douglas, she looks at these social beliefs and says, well, what they really are attempts to classify people. They arise in a morally ill-defined situation. So, for example, men and women who are not in a legal marriage, maybe living together, maybe having children together, and they're meant as a way for society to try and control, to categorize that relationship, and B, as a way for society to deliver a message to try and discourage those relationships. Now, we could have a whole course, or at least class session, about social changes and breakdowns of cultural classification systems like this, but I use this as an example of where Douglas looks at a particular social situation where the morality of the situation is ill-defined and says, aha, that's probably a place where we're going to see symbolic pollution beliefs at work. And I gave this example. The example that I just gave shows that to be the case. Another social condition that Douglas thought pollution beliefs would arise is when pragmatic control of behavior is not possible. So, for example, in my syllabus, I have this long section, and I point to a code on the University of Arizona website about academic dishonesty. And there's kind of a pollution belief behind academic dishonesty, that engaging in academic dishonesty puts you outside of the community. It's a violating of community norms. It's kind of dirty or cheating behavior. All things that are words about reprobation, about something gone wrong. And this is the kind of strong words and the strong notions around this behavior arise, especially because it's really hard. It's really hard to determine if academic dishonesty is happening, and it's oftentimes hard to prevent it, especially in the era of the internet. And actually, the era of the internet is actually bringing a lot of people to question, what do we mean by this pollution belief around academic dishonesty, and how do we even begin to police it in the internet era? But you can see that fundamentally, when this kind of control of academic dishonest behavior is fundamentally quite difficult, especially if people are intent on pulling it off. And so pollution beliefs around why it's a problem and what it says about someone have arisen over the last century as a way to try and to kind of keep the order of academic honesty together. And then here's one other example from Douglas about when we expect pollution belief, symbolic pollution beliefs or rituals around them to emerge. So for example, when individuals or societies are going through transitional states, we oftentimes think, as I mentioned with hazing rituals, those transitional states are times of disorder, times of where you're not sure criteria if someone's in or someone is out. And so we often, a social group will oftentimes invent rituals as a way of literally kind of cleansing people of that symbolic pollution and as a way of bringing them into the community. And you can think of all sorts of things, from baptism at the local church to hazing and a Greek fraternity ritual to freshman orientation week. These are all rituals that have been developed basically around symbolic pollution beliefs that these people are other or they're not up to snuff, and so we need to bring them through that time period. Douglas then wrote a terrific book, which the title is one of my favorite all-time social science titles, called Purity and Danger. So these two things that seem completely unrelated. Her whole point that was, if you look at a Durkheimian view of the world, you can see that there's actually a close relation between purity and danger. So let me give you some final thoughts about one of her extended examples of purity and danger. And she talks a little bit about this article, and it's about the idea of cleanliness. And her view was to look at dirt in a symbolic sense, so not dirt on the ground, but to look in the social world and see where claims about cleanliness actually have nothing to do with biological or bacterial cleanliness, but have to do with creating social order. And let me just kind of say a few things about how we would see this at work. We believe, for example, that people's ability to negotiate cleanliness tells us something about themselves. It may reveal something about their internal character. That's what we think. But there are caveats to this. So we think at certain times of life, say teenage years, you can kind of be sloppy. You can kind of maybe not shower a lot. You can kind of wear day-old clothes. But that's because we allow that teenage situation, that category, to be a certain way. But in other periods of life, say when you're going for your first job interview, if you're late or if you haven't showered in a couple days or you haven't cleaned your clothes, your job interviewer is going to take that as a presentation of your deepest self. So they'll take what they call cleanliness in their head, that person wasn't clean, as actually not about dirtiness per se or your ability to infect anyone, but instead about your kind of internal character, your internal moral state, and your ability to engage with social order. Cleanliness or beliefs about symbolic pollution beliefs about cleanliness, they demarcate purposes in life. So one of the big jokes about college is that it's often a place where everything's a mess, where working and eating and sleeping all occur in the exact same space. And that's allowed to happen. That's okay in college, because college is a special place. It's a space where disorder and chaos are intentionally allowed to be a part of life, because they may create, they generate creativity, or they generate change in you. So 4 years later, you're not the same person, or maybe 5 years later. 4 to 5 years later, you're not the same person you were before. But in other places, or in other times of life, eating, working, and sleeping don't occur in the same space. Think of, for many of you, maybe a childhood home, or think about a hotel that you've stayed in, or think about an office that you or your parents have worked in before. There are closely demarcated spaces between sleeping, well, no sleeping at all in some of those places, and eating and working. And that's because those are other social spaces that suggest other social purposes, and those we would call mixing those behaviors together dirty, whereas in a college dorm, for example, we wouldn't have that same evaluation of that. And let me give you some other examples of how what we call cleanliness behaviors are actually really about symbolic pollution beliefs and about trying to keep social order. So for example, your room versus your closet. Why is it okay to keep your closet totally disorderly and have dirty stuff and piles of stuff falling all over, but not have your room be that way? So if your parents come to visit or your loved one comes to visit and you want to show them something, that's because a closet symbolically is a space where dirtiness is allowed to be kind of kept at bay or to be pushed into the corner, whereas your regular room space, if somebody were to walk in and it looked like your closet, people would think you're dirty, or your ability to organize your life is dirty, whereas in the closet space, no big deal to keep it dirty like that. There are certain occasions where cleanliness behaviors are very heightened. So like on a date, if you go into a date not dressed nice, not having showered, not having brushed your teeth, not seeming to have done any of that, you're actually signaling that you don't really want to be on that date because you actually haven't done the things, the cleanliness behaviors that supposedly rid you of the symbolic pollution of somebody that may not be interested in me or may not be interested in dating. If you don't do these things, then you're actually showing that you're categorizing yourself in another state of life, i.e. not interested in this date, not interested in this person. Or here's another example of cleanliness, how cleanliness rules. What we think about cleanliness, as Douglas says, are really about categorization of people, times, and places. Think about the gym versus the library. Now, at the gym, mixing really amongst other people that are sweaty is totally okay. We don't worry when we're at the gym of catching something from somebody's sweat, or we don't worry about the fact that it seems dirty because we're in a space where there can be 100 or more people sweating like crazy and walking right by each other and even touching the same doorknobs. But in a library, imagine a bunch of people coming into the library soaked in sweat, touching the doorknobs, pulling off the books. We would kind of go, most of us would kind of go, ooh, that doesn't belong in here, or you're not supposed to do that in here. That's dirty. And so what Douglas points out is those reactions or those claims that that's dirty, that's wrong, are really about creating social order. They're really about marking times and places and phases of life where some things are supposed to happen and other things are not supposed to happen. So I may have been a little muddy in this lecture. I feel it myself actually a little bit. But these readings should give you a sense that classification processes are deeply a part of culture. They're fundamentally about ordering society, and they shift over time. And when we make grandiose claims about classification based on biology or bacteria in the case of cleanliness, or logic in the case of a lot of social disputes, what a week like this shows us that oftentimes those are about deep fears or deep concerns about the ordering of society, and that society has a logic of its own, oftentimes related to that sacred profane thing that I talked about from Durkheim, that orders all parts of our life and helps us to move through space and time in a coherent way. So I'll leave it there for now. If you have any questions, if this was a little unclear, feel free to email me and have some fun with that discussion post, or as much fun as you're able to have for a piece of homework. Okay, see you next week. Bye.